The insights of J. Martin on our world. Society and politics. The J. Martin Interview. 8 weeks into the lockdown, and I speak to political expert J. Martin about how it's all progressing now with the slightly different rules that there are in England compared to Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. There it's still stay home, but in England it's become stay safe and stay alert, control the virus. What does that actually mean, and what is now likely to happen in the future as a result of where we are with the coronavirus? Right, so we're now 8 weeks into lockdown, and at the moment, so one of the things is it has kind of changed quite a bit in England, hasn't it? Where you now have the freedom to at least go out and you could have a drive, for example, anywhere you can get to in one day and back, because obviously they're not allowing an overnight stay, so you can't use the camper van, for example. It's still stricter. It's still much more resembles the original rules of March the 24th in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, except that you can go out more than once, but you've got to remain in your local area. However, that is defined, so that sounds like really not going much beyond the town. But there's maybe some cynicism with the change of rules in England, because it would enable more people to go back to work, which would mean that the impact of the virus could be harder on the working class, for example. So whilst there's a bit of greater freedom, they seem to be very keen to get the economy running as soon as possible. One thing that there is a particular conflict on is the reopening of schools. Obviously, part of this might be because they wanted to make it possible for people to go back to work, so that kids go back to school at the same time, because otherwise they would have to arrange childcare. But cities such as Liverpool, the council there have said they will not be reopening, they will not be allowing the reopening of schools on June the 1st. So there's a sort of civil war almost over that around parts of the country as well, between the government, some local authorities and parents. Right, so I've got J. Martin and also Colin, who's going to discuss workplace safety this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the 107 stream.
Hi everyone, used to my voice by now. Yes, I suppose from my perspective it's a good afternoon, but whenever you're listening, good evening or good morning. I think that sounds like something out of the Truman Show, which is really how I think we're all feeling by now.
Yes, or Groundhog Day, obviously. Although, I mean, when you're on, well, I'm in a situation where I'm usually in the house for 7 days anyway. But so you start. A lot of people report that for the first time that they've had to do this sort of thing, extended staying at home sort of thing. They've not known the difference between any other days, and the weekends don't feel any different in this period.
Well, it's exactly the same with me. I don't know about you, Colin.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. I've been busy in the house. I do more work in the house than I do at work on a normal day. But yeah, I'm a Unite workplace and health and safety rep, so I'm very busy at the moment.
Yes, because obviously it's the situation of the virus, and also, well, we can only say that you work for a nuclear site of some sort, but what you're probably going to tell us is probably something about the way that coronavirus is affecting that industry.
Yeah, well, obviously the workplace is on shut down at the moment, and they're trying to sort of way of getting everybody back to work. Obviously, there's lots of different issues. Some companies seem to be engaging with union health and safety reps, whereas others don't seem to be interested in involving the unions. And that's in the wider community. Also, some of the local factories I'm hearing aren't putting the right or the correct procedures in place to keep people safe. So yeah, it's a very difficult time at the moment.
So you're really talking about what the situation that's come in with the social distancing and the wearing of face masks or and so on. The things that the changes that they should really be adapting to quickly, but you don't think that they actually are?
No, they don't seem to be at the moment. As I say, everything's just up in the air. Obviously, they can't. They're struggling to get PPE. What I'm hearing, some of the factories in the county are just blagging it, if you will. There's a lot of concerns. I mean, I had a number of calls off a lot of individuals, to be honest. Then they're very concerned about how things are panning out. So, yeah, it's a really difficult time.
So this would involve people who just have to be there. They have to go in because of obviously the industry just wouldn't run. And you've said you've been able to work from home to some extent, but you must obviously be in contact with people who just can't. That's not an option for them. They've got to go in.
Yeah, well, I'm actually in construction, so I can't work from home, sadly. But yeah, some of them they're classed as key workers, and like cleaners. Obviously, they need them there to keep the places clean. Obviously, it's folded at the moment. They've got to make sure it's done particularly well. So yeah, they've all got concerns. You know what I mean? They're always. I've had a lot of people.
If they try to raise their concerns with, say, the supervisors and bosses and so on, saying, look, we don't seem to be able to maintain social distancing here. I haven't really got the PPE that we need. You know, what tends to happen then? You know, are they acknowledged?
In some places they are, but in others they're just told they need to get on with it. They're encouraged to raise things, and when they do raise things, they're victimised, if you will. So it's not a good situation.
So does that mean that some people may have been turning to try and bring their own sort of protection in because they can't get it officially, and then their complaint really doesn't get anywhere? That would be the only option left, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, I have heard that where people have been going out and trying to buy their own protections. It's not a good situation to be in, especially, a lot of people are struggling to get it anywhere. A lot of companies are struggling to get it. So, to me, in this situation, they're unduly putting people at risk. Government have got some measures in place to protect people.
So why do you think it's such an issue in, say, a nuclear site? Just to imagine that for people not to be able to maintain social distancing, because there are situations you can so imagine that you just can't. People just have to be close together. It just wouldn't work. There's no way out. There's no way out of it. I mean, even the scenario of a bus driver. You've got the place where people come on now. They're using the cards, for example. They're encouraging the use of the contactless cards. So. But bus drivers have picked up the virus due to the fact that people get on right by them, and they still have to show that. But in a situation, say, such as the nuclear industry, why is it? Do you think people aren't able to maintain the 2 metre distance and such in some cases?
Not all the time. They can't. It's unavoidable in the nuclear industry, especially on the construction side as well, where you have trades that need 2, 3, 4 guys to do a particular job. So it's almost impossible to maintain that distancing.
I think that's a really good point as well. Just with construction, I mean, my mind went back to the time that we had a mining industry in the UK, and it's very similar there. It's you can't have lone working in some industries. My view for why Thatcher went after the miners is in fact because there is that degree of collective working anyway. And I mean, what we're seeing in construction, I mean, what Colin's just brought in is we're seeing this over the country. I mean, for example, reports in London of construction workers being told that they're essential workers, and yet they are building luxury high-rise apartments. I mean, I don't know, Colin. As someone who represents workers in construction, I mean, would you say building a high-rise apartment is essential? Is there any part of that building that is essential?
Definitely not. No, there's no call for that, and that's been going on right the way through this. I remember sitting watching it was back in March, where they were filming them all standing there in groups around these luxury apartments, contract workers, and I just thought, how can it happen? And it's there in full view of everyone. I can't understand how the government's actually letting it happen, to be honest, and the health and safety out the window for a lot of industry.
Yeah, so some people, again, they can't seem to provide the PPE for people who have to be close together when building something like this. Also, they're supposed to allocate, in some cases, an element of social housing, but again, within a lot of developments, or at least some percentage. But I'm not sure if, in some cases, maybe they simply don't allocate any, or there's,
You do get some social housing with I know with nuclear, for example. I mean, we've got, I suppose, in the northwest or near me, you've got two nuclear sites. You've got a power station and a decommissioning site. But to know where there's nuclear power, there can be some elements of social housing, but it's not really that common, if that makes sense.
So there's another situation as well is that you can look at as well. If there's no PPE, or there's hardly any, they can't get hold of any, and you're a worker who happens to be in the vulnerable condition. You might have diabetes, for example, or you might just simply be old, or you have underlying conditions. What do you think the situation would be if you were a key worker in some of these industries, but realised you were especially vulnerable to the virus and wanted to be furloughed? What sort of furloughed as a result? I've spoken to one person who said they've had problems with that and can't get furloughed despite being in a vulnerable health condition. What do you think would happen, or have you heard has happened when people have asked that if they think they're vulnerable?
Well, I'll chip in first before Colin, or I don't know if you want to say something quickly, Colin.
Well, just quickly on that, I have heard of individuals that are high risk, but they've actually been told to go on the sick. Now, the sick pay in the construction industry is shocking. So basically, the companies have been sending them home and saying you're going on the sick. Now, in the construction industry in this area, I believe that has been sorted now. But I still have fears if people start going back to work and it hikes again. And I've got a feeling that people will be sent home, and they will only it works out as 200 quid a week.
Well, statutory sick pay has only been set at the same rate that universal credit has been temporarily raised to, which is about £94 a week. So is that the typical situation, or can it be higher?
Yeah, it can be higher because we get there's an industry sick pay as well on top of that.
Well, that's something, but it's still lower. It's still lower than what they would normally. It doesn't represent 80% of the wage, though, and that could be an important point, because obviously, furloughing is 80% of the wage actually being paid by the government. So if they're not getting that, they're in a disadvantaged situation.
Definitely, yeah, I agree.
So it's not 80%. So we've seen really the impacts on the way that the virus is, that you just, in some situations, people just cannot work together. Work rather in a social distancing way. Right now, we could actually go back to the general point of the way the lockdowns changed actually in England, which is that is that it's now changed that people can go out and have the general freedom of going anywhere within one day. For example, from the northwest, you could drive to the West Midlands or the Peak District and come back, but you couldn't do an overnight stay. So that means that the emphasis and the message has changed from, in England, stay home to stay safe, stay alert, and the public have to do their own social distancing measures. So what do you actually think about the way it's changed then, Jay?
Well, I'm not really sure when it comes to change. That there really has been too much. I mean, who really knows what the government's message is? I mean, when you have government advisors such as Professor Van Tam explaining the government's actions on February the 30th, it does lead you to a few questions.
February the 30th, he actually said that, just to cut in, there's gaffes and there's gaffes, isn't there? He actually did mention February the 30th, something I missed.
Yes, well, obviously standards in some universities are coming down. I mean, it's genuinely a mistake, I get that, but really just a flavour of this government's response, although I should add that he isn't in government, just advising. I think the idea of any real change to lockdown is problematic, and I think one of the key problems actually comes down to the colour scheme that's used with the overall message. So we had in a clear red and yellow, a sort of fast food approach, if you will. Stay at home, protect lives, save the NHS. That was in a red theme, which was no, stop, stay at home. We then have now this green message, which is stay alert. I mean, viruses are that small, you shouldn't be able to see them with your own eyes. So how you can be alerted to them is one thing. But the fact that it's green, as in we go back to normal. And I think a lot of people have, by and large, tried to return back to normal. Equally, in saying that, there are a even larger number of people who are still isolating, staying at home and doing all of that. But the advice for, going out for walks, even that was confused with, you could go into a park to meet one parent, but you couldn't meet both of them.
Well, that's how it is now. I mean, that's how it is now. But before you couldn't do that even. But they said you could drive somewhere as long as the exercise was longer than where it took to drive there. But now that's changed. So that's one of the recent slightly more liberal rules have come in. Except for you can't meet two parents, that's one problem. But, of course, that'll happen anyway, because they specifically worded it as one parent.
Well, we've got here in Cumbria some of the worst figures, really, the worst infection rates in the country. I think if you're in order of deaths per 10,000, we're somewhere like fourth from the top on that list. And in part, that's it does appear to be concentrated around the south of Cumbria, where you can easily access, like Windermere, for example. And there's part of me that wonders how much of that is people going for a little drive to the Lake District and spreading diseases in this way. I mean, if we were just really clear about the way in which viruses spread, it's in droplets. It's when you breathe out and when you cough and all of this, and people stopping and having a chat, even on a fell somewhere, there is still a method in which you can transmit, or if you're stopping at a shop and things like that. I think the confused message is even worse when you've then got the other nations and region of the country saying, no, we're actually sticking to the previous message because we believe that protects people. So you have Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland now differing from the UK government and England, which for me, seems absolutely insane. I get why it is people want to, why they want some freedom back. It is, we're not designed to be stuck in houses of varying size.
Varying size, yes, absolutely varying size, yes.
And often dependent upon your economic means is where the size of that house is. So this virus doesn't discriminate, but it seems government policy does, even if that's indirect. So I understand why people want to move out, but just a broader note on something the government said when they began easing some of these restrictions, and employers who were obsessed and still are in some instances with just profit, not the human cost. The government had followed up with there'll be a cure by September. I think it was Shamak Ali who said, by September that we should have a cure. Just if I might, just a bit of a background. The coronavirus family has been dated back as far as the 9th century BC. So you've got alpha, beta, gamma, delta coronavirus, not necessarily in order of discovery, but I mean the oldest one, beta coronavirus, 3,300 BC. Just a note on this: this has been plaguing us for 9 millennia, and we don't have a cure for any of them. We haven't cured the common cold, and there was something of a World War One, it'll all be done by Christmas approach, and we know how that went. So this isn't going away quickly. And having mixed messages, lack of clarity, and a real lack of general information and education for the people who are listening to these government policy changes and advice, I think is going to cause a lot more problems. When you have what a sorry scene to see people queuing up for coffee outside a Costa Coffee. Midway through a pandemic, I thought, is this really essential? Or for that matter, McDonald's workers working in close quarters in a very Taylorist way, serving people who are now going to have McDonald's delivered. I thought I think we've missed something along the line here.
Well, some places like that have reopened when they've been shut for about 6 weeks. So, but when you saw that queue, was it not? I mean, I can see some shops from here where I'm based, and people were standing 2 meters. So it made a good photograph because it went past all of the shops just to go into one. Now, so you've been talking a lot about how social distancing seems to be breaking down. So, because otherwise, a visit to the Lake District or to go into a shop if the social distancing should be working isn't working then, because what were these people who were queuing for Costa like? Were they not social distancing?
No, there was social distancing. It was more the idea that why would you go out to buy a coffee? It's not essential. And my further point was really around workplaces as well. We'll hear from Colin maybe about this, but where you've got industries where people work in close quarters, and the nature of their work might not be what's deemed as essential. Employers have seen this as an excuse to, we can reopen the shop doors. I understand Costa Coffee, in order to survive, needs to have, and I'm just picking on that as an example, needs to have some money. That's the nature of business at the end of the day. But I do wonder, I really do wonder whether or not by opening things that aren't essential. I mean, for example, good strategy, I have to say, if we look to some other countries where you've got practical things like some DIY shops, for things like repairs and construction. That's it's a little bit more than just, so people can go and put a new garden in or, buy a new sink. It's actually for the repairs that aren't going on because offices have been closed, for example. There's no maintenance, cleaning, and things do need repaired if they're not maintained. Where you have sort of the reopening then of, okay, well, some banks, etc. Some other types of smaller supermarkets can reopen. You've got bakers and butchers can reopen, but strictly no restaurants or hotels. That seems to be a much more sensible way of doing it, rather than the the first thing we did out of lockdown was reopen McDonald's.
Well, they've opened some branches, I think, so far, which are mostly down in the south, actually. If you're a Mackey's fan in Luton, though, there's quite a few branches open there, but not really much open in the northwest if you're listening locally, such as Bromborough or Ellesmere Port, for example, are not, or Cheshire Oaks are not back yet. So for a sort of sad face emoji might be coming over you right now with you, but a lot of local takeaways have in fact reopened, with some of them just having click and collect and takeaway. Obviously, nobody's going in the shop as normal. What was interesting is some local chippies, you had a situation that just before the lockdown was called, everybody was in there and then it was just gone. So that's the way it's had to adapt. I mean, would you think that takeaways, given the role that they play in providing food, even though it can be of the fast food nature, obviously. They're all back in most cases.
I think delivery. Oh, sorry, Colin.
Well, I think this message, stay alert. How can you stay alert to something that you can't see, you can't trust? I think it's the thing the government have done to pass the buck, because they've made such a bad mess of this. It's an idea to pass the buck. I think what they were trying to do last weekend is get everybody to go out and start congregating in the lakes, up, all over the country, really. And because it didn't pan out that way, now blaming the scientists. So I think it's just government trying to pass a buck, because I really do think that some criminal negligence cases after this.
Well, do you think they might even be going for herd immunity by the back door, which we know?
I do, yeah.
Because obviously you can shield the most vulnerable people if you can identify them. Eventually, it even becomes a strategy that works because if enough people have become immune to it, which we don't yet know if they fully do. That's one problem as well, because we don't know if it comes back in a second or third strain to someone who's already had it, but perhaps it's weaker the second or third time around. But if we manage to,
I think it's an important point. This notion of herd immunity. Just before the Second World War, we should really call it what it is, which is a form of eugenics. And given the recent celebration of VE Day, I think it's important that a lot of people lost their lives to stop that sort of society from forming. Eugenics being whereby you try and breed a stronger race, survival of the fittest, extreme Darwinism. And it doesn't necessarily work. We already know, like all other viruses, this particular virus is stable, but it is mutating. It's beginning. There are some strains of this virus that have adapted to human anatomy, which it wasn't particularly designed for. Not that I'm suggesting it's been designed in a lab, albeit there might be some questions on that. But the way it's evolving is it's making it easier to infect, in other words, become more contagious. There are now identified 14 strains of this, in which some of the protein sheets have become a little bit more, I'm really simplifying this, but a bit more spiky, shall we say, so it can invade cells. So when we're talking about immunity, to which strain are we talking about?
So in other words, you might not get. So that's why we keep getting the common cold. So,
Right.
well, it sounds like the most nightmare scenario in this is that we could have a very serious virus that's constantly mutating that we can never find a cure for or a vaccine. And surely the problem is going to be that society just can't spend all its time on lockdown for, say, a decade or something. So something technology is going to have to come into place, and some way of basically living with it is going to have to come into play surely by that point.
I think Colin is absolutely right with the idea that it's herd immunity by the back door, and that they are trying to blame people. Let's be blunt about it. There have been some stupid people out there, but by and large, people have remained in lockdown. They have gone through quite a bit of pain and all of this, but the government, desperate to shift the blame as they have been over the past 10 years onto anyone but them. I think with this virus, I mean, if we're really, really clear about it, I think that there's history has a lot to do with this. I think this country's advice is from 1665. Talk about that in a bit. But in terms of the situation we're in today, this is because of 10 years of government cuts. Let's not make any mistake about it. Our response from masks to equipment to beds to you name it has been our response has been severely hampered because for the past 10 years, in order to line the pockets of the top 5%, and again blame the workforce from 2008 for the banking crisis, which then got very subtly renamed austerity. The cuts that the government have again blamed the workers for have gone to cut down the NHS, police numbers, you name it. Class sizes have increased. You've got all of that versus not the payoff of debt, but cutting taxes for the rich, and we are living with the consequences of those decisions.
Such as, for example, there being about, I don't remember the exact figures, but I think a John Pilger video said just how many less beds there are now in the NHS compared to what there were at one point, and it was something ridiculous, like down to a third or a quarter, but can't remember the exact figure, but it was substantially less. So the NHS is actually substantially less big than it used to be.
Just have a look at the lessons from the banking crisis. So it started off as credit crunch, which sounded like some form of cereal. Have your credit crunch in the morning, with some milk. It then moved to the banking crisis, and no one needed to question who was responsible for that. But very subtly after that, it became austerity and blame the disabled, blame the poor, blame the immigrants, the Muslim. It became about blaming rather than looking at the banks who at this point had to wear nappies or diapers because they were wetting themselves so much with laughter. But we accepted it, and it wouldn't surprise me in the next few months if this virus is actually renamed the People's Virus, very subtly, as a way of blaming us for it.
The People's Virus. Well, I suppose when it's named after the place it came from, or allegedly came from, then such as Spanish flu, or Donald Trump is very keen to call it the Chinese virus, for example. So you could say that you could say that's maybe a form of blame. Or we came out of there, so you're to blame. So.
Well, oddly enough, if we were to interview a virus, it probably wouldn't recognise the concept of a country.
No, but it just just happens where it happens, doesn't it? For whatever reasons, which is not. I mean, both from the mainstream perspective and the alternative thinking, it's not very clear at all, really, how it started. So
let's just be really honest as well. Spanish flu actually originated in Houston, Texas.
So it should be called the Texan flu, or
Yeah.
that would be a whole other interview, obviously. So this herd immunity, where it breaks down is actually, where we go back, is that ideally it would come to a point where you could hardly be infected by anyone, and if you were vulnerable, there wouldn't be so many people to be infected by. That's the best of it, but the worst of it is not really knowing who to protect exactly that clearly, and also the fact that there will be an awful lot of people who do succumb to it before you get to that point. So it's a simple enough idea of what would be wrong and right about it, but it's something that would also just happen without any attempts to try and suppress it, suppress the virus.
I think another point about herd immunity is I've seen this over the past, again, 10, 15 years, this idea of away from eugenics, but to instead sort of assisted suicide. Now we've got the underlying conditions idea, and it's essentially writing off the elderly. Now, politically speaking, that the over 60s are not my best friends, having voted for the Tories God knows how many times, and Brexit and all of this. But when I hear flippant remarks about an underlying condition, I mean, how many over 60s do you know who haven't got an underlying condition? It's almost like, the act of growing gold is under attack as well, and that somehow they're not useful to society. This isn't, again, it's not herd immunity. This is eugenics. This is the idea of survival of the fittest, where the older essentially binned off and only the fittest should participate in society. This is really what it smells of. It's just my view.
Well, they keep trying to put up the pension age. I mean, so if it plays into whether they're actually bothered in the government about, say what's happening in care homes is that, say nurses that work there or staff who don't have PPE are just carrying the virus from one room to another, which is why it's so widespread in care homes.
That's again, that's the incompetence of this group. And sending people into forms from hospital out of the genocide.
Do you think it is something that, I mean, this is the most controversial territory you can cross into? Do you think it's actually something that would be deliberate, or do you think it's because it does seem to be that to prevent that happening in care homes, you would just need to have the right PPE. So it's either that it's a shambles, or that they're quite on the quiet, sort of happy about the situation to exist where it does spread so easily through care homes. So that's.
Well, I know one care worker who actually contracted coronavirus, and I think it was about 7-8 days after she contracted it. She was told to stay at home and self-isolate, and then she was phoned by the care home and asked to go back to work. And she's still positive for it. So, they must just expect that it's right in the care homes, and they just don't care. So
what about, did they have the PPE? I don't suppose if she went back or not, but if you think that if she was positive for it, she didn't go. But if she did and didn't have the PPE, that's just going to spread it right around the care home, isn't it? So.
I think they've got the basic minimum thing. I don't think it's standard of what it should have. It's the same with the testing. They keep going on about the testing in the care homes. And I know carers, I know quite a lot of carers, to be quite honest. And they tell me that hardly any of them is being tested. So it's just, conferences you have every day, it's just lie after lie after lie, to be honest.
Do you think that's just kind of incompetency again, because they can't get the number of tests? They can't get. I mean, I've seen how some countries have had so many more tests so much faster. Why can they do that actually? And that's Germany's one of them, I think. Why can they do that? Why can't the UK do that as well?
because Germany were probably prepared where this government just probably shrugged their shoulders and just didn't take any notice of what they should be doing, to be honest.
Well,
Look, in the early days of this, the government did have about a 3-month, 4-month warning that there was something coming, and really didn't do too much. I mean, it's not just the UK. There's other countries that fit into that, but and really the approach has been a sort of shrug-shouldered approach anyway. And when the goings got tough for them, they've immediately gone to the blame game.
I suppose they were focused on things like building HS2. That it was just the sort of scenario that they wouldn't be prepared for. That sort of government, maybe. I mean, I don't know whether there's something in that as well. Whether it just does not suit this type of government, this situation, compared to a socialist one.
Here's the real problem, and here's how the history books are going to read this. The last general election in the UK in December 2019, the country voted on the single issue of leaving the United Kingdom, leaving the European Union. Although the history books might also mean the United Kingdom is a thing of the past. And so what we've got is a parliament with elected officials who were elected on a single topic, Brexit. I mean, I've just seen that the UK government has said that there will be there will be checks on goods entering Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK from next January. So while we've got a crisis going on in terms of public health, unemployment, and in fact now automation, what we've got is a government who's pressing ahead with Brexit, despite no negotiations, and that seems to be its focus still. I'm not surprised by it. We could have had more testing, more masks, if we'd have joined one of the EU bulk purchasing schemes, but because of ideology, we decided that wasn't something that we would do. So I think that has quite a bit to do with it. Whatever anyone's views on this, the idea should be that leaving the customs union should be furloughed by another year while we focus on this. Government time should not be focusing on a racist immigration bill that's just passed, one of two acts that have gone through over the past few months. Nor really should we be focusing at the minute on Brexit. I mean, passing an immigration bill right now when no one's travelling, well, I should say no one's travelling. Then again, the UK's only just started to quarantine people flying into the country.
Yes, that was incredibly late. I want to say about the immigration bill, I'm not sure about other ones, but there was one proposed that would restrict immigrants who are not able to earn over £35,000 a year and bring in a point system that they've already got, similar to the one they've already got in Australia, but it was actually dropped. It's actually been quietly dropped, but it did have an article, possibly because they know that they would lose the cheap labour that they might have had, during a situation like this. But if it, I don't know about other ones, but that one has actually been dropped. So
yeah. Well, the bill is still extremely racist in my view, and either way, like I say, it's not what we should be focusing on. But what should have happened is all ministers should have been given a health brief, every single one of them. Some people have called for a unity government, but I have mixed feeling on that. But every minister should have been given some form of health brief, as well as their own, to focus on this particular crisis. And instead, we've not. We just haven't had it. We've got, schools Um, just I think the opening point during the top of the show was around, schools opening. Well, I think it should be as simple as this. When schools can stop head lice spreading, that's when they reopen.
So to use that as a marker. And just to go back to immigration before we move off it again, is that the government obviously got elected with with that sort of rhetoric about about Brexit, and they have this immigration bill which they've now actually dropped. What's interesting is also ironic compared to that is that they were not bothering with this quarantine for ages and ages of people coming in. So people were actually free to come in with the virus during many weeks where England was still in the strictest lockdown. Those flights were arriving. So that's
because I think that again was part of the blame someone else or another blame the immigrant idea. I think that was the deliberate, calculated call behind that. That they could blame immigrants or people flying into the country. Not that they really were immigrants or anything like that, but still, you don't need to get the xenophobia out of people by saying they're immigrants. You just say people, foreigners coming into the country. That'll do it.
Oh yes, I mean, I suppose it's whichever word is least loaded, I suppose, because emigrant doesn't seem to have the same negative connotations in the right-wing media when it comes to British people living in the Costa del Sol and all that sort of hold. So that's just the opposite word to immigrant. So it depends on the connotations of the word, because it could be positive or negative. So with schools. They wanted to be June the 1st, and this is probably because of getting people back to work and such like. And there's a bit of a civil war about that. What do you reckon the policy should be with schools instead of saying June the 1st? Well,
I think personally that they should wait until these figures start coming down properly, because we're seeing deaths. You maybe get to like Sunday and Monday, and you're looking and you think, maybe a bit of joy here. The figures look as though they're coming down, and then you get to Tuesday, Wednesday, and they go back up again. They've also found this Kawasaki disease, which is very frightening. And I mean, a lot of parents that I talk to say they're just going to refuse to send them back to school. As you said before, there's councils like Liverpool who are refusing to open their schools. So I think it's actually crazy at the moment to do that. I know it's got to happen at some stage, but at the moment I don't think it's the right time.
Yes, and obviously that will differ again with what's happening in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. What's interesting about when you say schools, it's not all schools actually. They seem to particularly be trying to reopen primary schools, probably because of the of them trying to get people back to work. It's the youngest children. It's hardest to get childcare. Secondary schools, high schools aren't actually mentioned as opening on June the 1st, so I guess that must be the reason for that.
Well, there's just there's a few things that just are important. One is, well, schools. I totally agree with Colin there. I think it's far too early. But there are schools that have been open still. Educating the kids of so-called key.
Yes.
Key workers.
They have been open for them. Yes, that's something you might not have realised, but yeah, because they can't get, because that's childcare basically, isn't it?
Yeah, well, in effect, absolutely. But another thing, just about education, which a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with, or they don't consider, is that most education is and operates as a business. So you have academies. They are not public schools in the way that they're completely owned by the state. They are a for-profit. They have a franchise system.
So
Colleges.
Just to cut in there, that they were allowed by the coalition government, weren't they? So it was a change that was brought in after 2010 for these types of institutions. Some of them are quite one called Michaela or something, or Michaela, similar to my name, run in West London. It has this strict regime of discipline. It's like almost like Trunchbull from Matilda, where kids are shouted at as they run, if they run, not just run down the corridor, but not allowed to talk during lessons, and all of that. These varying types of school were allowed to exist after 2010. So that tells you something. Rather than just the standard garden variety schools that we have before. Yeah. But carry on.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Sorry, I've got to use a very technical phrase here, but it's called the commodification of higher education. So what it means is, it's an awful phrase, really, to describe an awful development. So basically, it means that we'll just focus on one area for the time being, but it means that universities no longer perceive themselves to be centres of higher learning, but they're now centres for making money. So I am going to name and shame on this occasion one such university, which is my alma mater of Keele University. So a classic case of jettisoning successful university courses that attract British students in order to attract overseas students who pay treble the amount of academic fees. So 27,000 compared to 9,000 for a British student. And as such, jettisoning programs so that they can attract overseas students so they can make money. That's just one example. A lot of colleges make money per student. So again, they will draw down money from government per student on a course. Those colleges will then take 50%, 60% of the money they take from the government, and the rest then goes to tutors, and to lecturers, etc. So we're not talking about, even before this crisis, we talk about the commodification of education. In other words, turning it into a commodity. That's been going on for quite a while. So I would just suggest the following. What is instructing a lot of these schools to open, and I appreciate that a lot of primary education isn't opening, and good. But what is instructing what's going on behind the scenes is colleges are quietly reopening. So on the 1st of June, I know of at least 50 colleges that will be reopening. Universities too, and that's simply because nothing to do with the health environment, and I'm not surprised they've not been mentioned, to be honest. And that's why I'm mentioning it. They're making decisions based upon their balance sheet. So they want to begin getting more money. If you speak to a lot of education workers, from cleaners, for example, they haven't been furloughed. And that's because they're subcontracted mostly. The government put in a nice little exclusion for public workers, which was, if you're in receipt of public money, you can't be furloughed. Mm. So just on that piece, we're focusing on primary, which is, of course, no one should be going back. I mean, no one really, we shouldn't be talking about going back to school up until the next term. Most qualifications, for example, at high school degrees, have fallen back to essentially crisis grading, but they can use things like coursework to instruct grades, and of course they can be challenged. Why are we hurrying kids back?
Well, that's a good point, really, because I mean, that really kind of points to it being about getting people back to work, and because by June the 1st, it's not exactly very far from the summer holidays at the end of July. They typically are the last 6 weeks, which is actually, we've been on lockdown for that long, and not more now. But yes, and the groups they've particularly chosen to target as well points to that as well, which is the fact that it's the the youngest kids they particularly want, because high schools don't seem to be reopening at all. And colleges and universities, I mean, and lectures will take place over Zoom or whatever it is, or virtual. Probably not Zoom, but something virtual, something. So I was wondering about, to turn this slightly on its head, I've been wondering about the question about the effect of the lockdown on people. So we've got the idea that it's supposedly more sensible that Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland have stayed in it, which means it's a closer situation still there as it was in England to house arrest, where you could only really go out for essential reasons. They've got to stick to the area, and that's been going on for 8 weeks, and we don't quite know how long that could be going on before they ease this as well. Now there's been a mental health crisis going on as well, where some people have taken their lives as a result of lockdown. And some people have not been able to cope very well with isolation. There's also the other side where it's eased the stress for some people because they've taken away all the stresses they had to deal with. So it's actually worked in two ways. The question would be, is how long should lockdown be tolerated for? Do you think? Because it seems unending. If they come, although the rates are coming down, well, they are even with the inflated figures, they're still down week on week. When you get the slightly higher ones over Tuesday, Wednesday. How long should it be tolerated before something else is tried because of the mental health toll on people and the restrictions for society to operate as well?
My answer to that is, I think just until it's safe to lift it. I mean, because if you go down that route where you lift the lockdown, what has been the point in it? You know what I mean? It should. I think the figures should come right down before we even decide to think about it. But the economy obviously is a big thing, and we all know that. And at some stage they have to lift this lockdown. But if it spikes again, it's going to make it even worse. That's my opinion on it.
So also in the situation here, we've got a partial easing in England. I mean, a lot of people, some people are critical of that, but actually that could help people who are feeling trapped, because you can now go out all day, and then it comes down to this point of social distancing. Why doesn't it work? Say you come to the Lake District in a car and you go for a walk, but you keep the distance between other walkers. Maybe you're careful with surfaces as well. Why doesn't that do enough then to combat the virus? If people do keep their distance, why does it have to come down to house arrest is a question I've been asking.
Well, I think just on the point of and again, Colin's absolutely right. I think the point of the economy, I did just been trying to do some quick calculations before the call. I haven't managed to complete them, so I'll just give you some general idea. We want to talk about the economy. If we went back to 2010 levels of taxation, and we were to have captured all of the tax that's been evaded and avoided owed to this country, we could pay for the current furlough scheme for another 20 years. So let's just be cautious on, the Fed economic idea. The answer is, for me, it's when it's safe to do so. That has to be instructed by evidence. As I say, we are not going back. I suppose back on, I think, the 11th of March, when I was stood in front of a group of reps for what I began to realise would be the last time. That anything that I considered normal on that day, I wish I'd have written down, because it won't ever return back to that normality. So we need to be evidence-based and not based on the nonsense of the government, but we've got to be practical. I've given you the example of you can meet up with one parent in a park, but not two, even though you're surrounded by hundreds of strangers you've never met before. I think one of the ultimate things will be should be, in fact, the lifting of meeting immediate family. I wouldn't include friends at that point, but immediate family. This idea of keep it in the family, I don't mean as some vulgar remark. I mean, keep it in the family as in, if a family member's suffering, that a family member, mum, dad, sister, brother, husband, wife, whatever, will want to help. And the idea of there being a restriction in seeing, I mean, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and one of the things that I wanted to say, having been incredibly depressed over the past few weeks, I've also had some very good days in this way. But being trapped, not able to see loved ones, it pays a heavy toll on individuals, and I think that the mental health crisis that awaits us is going to be significant and worsen. And I would suggest that there is going to be about a window of maybe 3 to 4 months in which you can relieve lockdown to enable visits to family. Like I say, friends, you don't know really where people have been. Family, to a better degree, you'd like to think that that they would, because I think that when we approach winter or autumn, we're going to see a much larger spike with this particular infection. So I think that lockdown is going to be with us for at least another year and a half yet, before there is some sort of relieving medicine developed. Like I say, I don't think there'll be a cure. If there's a cure for this, then that means we've sorted the common cold as well, by implication.
Would you say that people would have to go without seeing their friends all that time? And I can talk about my personal situation of we always went to see one friend nearly every night, so that we haven't done. So obviously I'm expecting to see some not too long to seeing.
According to government advice, you can. You can go meet them in a park or have some distanced. Other meeting, apparently.
Well, I do mean in a house. So, but obviously the situation to be able to see family and friends is something we would hope would be lifted. And so the talk about trying to maintain strict measures for a year and a half, maybe it just won't be possible because so many people are breaking it already. There's so many people who still have parties or barbecues, for example, and the police even say that they're powerless to deal with most of them, or at least I've even said I don't think they will deal with just every single incident of that. If people snitch on it, with the line.
What you need to have a look at, though, is where are the principal areas in which people can spread disease: hospitals and doctor surgeries, workplaces, and then at home. So there are some ridiculous things that I've seen. So in France, the idea that you've got to drive your car wearing a mask is laughable. There's a lot of nonsense out there, but if you take hospitals, chronic underfunding, and they are still operating. So you can't silo them. So they're not really under any lockdown, albeit they are reduced capacity. Workplaces, there is almost certainly going to be a flurry of economic activity in the next 3-4 months, where employers are going to insist people get back to work. Now, I think the hot weather is going to mean that, as generally speaking, viruses don't tend to transmit as rapidly as they do during winter months. Lots of complicated reasons not going into this. just now, at least. But I think we're going to see some sort of low-level transmission in workplaces. And because of that low level, in my experience, employers have, by and large, well, there's some examples of good practices. By and large, when it comes to health and safety and workers' rights, employers tend to ignore what the law says anyway. And whilst some directors are very surprised by the behaviours of managers, we all know the saints in workplaces. But equally, we all know the mini Hitlers who think that they're running an empire. I call them the workplace celebrity. We all know about those people. Well, okay, workplaces that have got saints. So I'll give you a practical example of this. Already, a group of workers have returned back to work, and one of the one particular rep, it's not a member, but a rep had said his wife is pregnant. There's some underlying conditions. I don't feel safe coming back to work. His boss, decent guy, said, no, well, here's what we'll do. Medical suspension. There we go. But in that same workplace, so tempted to mention his name, but anyway, little Hitler number one has basically said, if you don't turn up to work, you're sacked. So all it takes is a really bad manager to spread this.
Yes, somebody. Yeah.
That's one of my key worries, which is the lockdown of keeping people trapped at home is causing lots of issues. I mean, the first generation, I think, for a long time, where no mum or dad can say they haven't watched their kids grow up if they're still together. That is. But my concern is we ease the lockdown. Employers are going to try and revert back to the mean, try and go back to the previous practices, and that we can't do that.
So you're talking about the new normal, actually. Oh, yes.
Sorry, can I just come in on that? Because I know of one company who have sent letters out to all their employees and told them they're going to enforce a week's holiday on them. So basically taking away 5 days holiday, paying them for them, even though they're getting paid at the moment 80%, the furlough. So they're actually only going to pay them 20% for their holidays. They've told them that's going to happen. They haven't asked them to volunteer these holidays. They've told them it's going to happen. So there we go. It's the start of some serious things to come.
Well, that's an example.
Challenges before long, I think.
That's an example of them just making up the law as they go along, then, because because that is similar to what Jay was just saying there, where they will, when they're faced with these changes, some employers will just, we'll do this just because we've decided to, and that's it. And in the case before, where it was mentioned about asking for furlough, not being able to get it because of being subcontracted, I do know someone, without naming them, who said they're in that situation. They do have an underlying health condition, sort of close to diabetes, high blood pressure, and they feel at risk from the virus more. And he is just saying he has to go back to work because he can't access the furlough. He says that, and that's because of his employment status, which is that he's subcontracted. He's almost treated as if he's self-employed, but as we know, that often doesn't mean you're really in a genuine self-employed situation. It just means that they are getting out of certain rights that you should have as an employee, which means you can't access the furlough. You can't.
Well, exactly, and the furlough scheme is flawed. I think if you say furlough quick enough, you get to furlough flawed. Basically, the number of people who are falling through. Essentially, the country received a 20% pay cut, plus the number of people. As I say, if you're in in the public sector or in receipt of public funds, then you can't be furloughed. So people falling through the cracks, people who are in bogus self-employment because of government cuts. Again, if you're sick, how anyone can survive on a couple of £100 a month is a disgrace. And I'd just suggest the results from Finland, who were trialling universal basic income. One of the key points there is it didn't decrease people's appetite to work, it increased it. Once you had that financial security behind you, it actually increased people's want to be productive at work, which has been a key argument of the government for a universal basic income.
Well, yes, that's what's interesting. It's been opposed by the right-wing side, saying that, well, people will just not want to do anything then, or they'll want to just to watch TV and all that. But actually what tends to happen is it can be the opposite because you're more empowered. What's interesting now is that they haven't got that, but they're in a situation of paying 80% of people's wages and creating a situation which is almost temporarily like that for many people, except for those that don't qualify because of those problems, as you say, that about some of the reasons why some people can't access it. So that's the thing about the new normal. Anyway, is something that there's a bit of a concerning phrase. It sounds sort of Orwellian. It sounds like a lot of people are thinking, well, could we get back to normal? Can we get over this and then get back to where we were and the way we lived? Now, how long would we really have to wait? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Before just simply going back to the way we were because there's no threat from the virus anymore.
We won't.
You think when you say we won't, you're talking sort of 2050, 2031, or just, this sort of thing.
Without looking at the collapse of empires or anything like this, we won't return back to normal. You talk about class sizes. You've got kids who you look at a standard classroom size. You want to put 30 kids next to each other, 28, 29, 30 kids. No, they're not going to have it. Sitting next to each other is going to be a thing that makes people uncomfortable. How many times have you watched, if you've got a TV or a YouTube or something like this, where you've seen people too close together and you've gone, oh, doesn't feel right.
Well, at the moment it doesn't. At the moment, but surely there's going to come a point where it's over and we're going to be back to normal because there is no virus to worry about because the pandemic will be over. That's what's concerning about this phrase of the new normal. Surely there's going to become a point where we can go back to normal because we're not going to be paranoid about everybody around us.
But normal has been employers making up the laws as they go along. Normal has been the likes of Branson and others not paying their taxes because they're, technically on a tax haven on an island. It's been the all but abolition of the NHS, the rise of 0-hour contracts. I mean, I don't want to return to that normal, and I don't think. I mean, the idea that we can't afford to do things. I mean, I know that I've criticised the British public as being stupid at times, but I don't think people will, or I'd like to think people don't have that short a memory that they want to return directly back to that.
So really, you're talking about the chance of revolution, really, but the way, or a very simple, very slow sort of subtle revolution of changes to the way the old order that were also not so good and were quite dystopian anyway, and you're hoping that this will actually be a new age that will set some of these things straight. And that sounds a more positive take on a new normal than the idea that we're going to have to live in a dystopian sort of mask-based social distancing, not being able to meet people, not being able to go to cafes and restaurants sort of society that the new normal usually brings up in your head. So I mean, we want to get away from that at some point, don't we? We want to get past that, even if we do get a better order in society as a result of this shake-up.
I think myself that one day we will get back to some type of normality where you can meet people, you can socialise and do the things that you're used to do. But I think Jay's right what he's saying. This is a game changer in this country, people are going to look at this government and think you have just totally made a total mess of this whole situation. And I think people are going to start rebelling and thinking, why should we put up with this? Low wages, treating care workers and NHS staff like second-class citizens, cleaners, bus drivers, all these other, key workers, that's shop workers and things like that. I think it's time people now realised that they're worth a lot more than what they've been, under this Tory government, to be honest. So I'm hoping for that anyway.
Well, that's what's interesting, isn't it? And I don't know how we can predict this. Will this change the electorate's view, do you think, of the Conservative Party, basically? Because there's a lot of people who would get behind VED Day celebrations, clapping on a Thursday, might actually be thinking it's all being handled fairly okay, or they're quite patriotic anyway, and they're not going to be that cynical about the establishment. Will it really change things? Could it be favourable for Labour, for example?
I don't think it'll change the electorate immediately, but I think it already has changed the parties. The idea that the Tories would be responsible for renationalising the railways 2 years ago would have laughed at you in your face. That's exactly what's happened.
Oh, yes.
What happens with that afterwards is I think they'll move immediately to make a quick sale, to their friends. But I don't actually have any faith in the British electorate. To be honest, the susceptibility to the media and a lot of nonsense peddled by the media is, I think that's something, unfortunately, that's a little bit too advanced. But I wonder whether or not it will not change the electorate, but change the elected. We've seen, I have to say to the media, the BBC's, the BBC News, the Sky News and all of this are looking completely out of place as compared to Channel 4. And I have to say it, a phone hacking former media hack editor, Trump supporting, Johnson supporting at one point, Piers Morgan, has been the odd person who's kept this government to check and account all the way through.
That's right, he has, yes, and he's the one who said he voted for Boris Johnson and didn't back Corbyn. So it'd be interesting to see if Jeremy Corbyn had got into power for whatever reason, because it seems almost impossible. How if he'd have done many of the same measures, whether he'd have just got an absolute mountain criticism from the establishment press and so on, compared to when Boris Johnson would make the same decisions. For example, paying 80% of all wages would have been considered something that would probably be on the front pages of the Sun as he's a loony sort of thing, so it's almost, who is favoured, who is allowed to do things. They did say to Jeremy Corbyn, allegedly, we will never let you govern. We will never let you. So...
Well, exactly, and I don't think that the establishment had any intention of allowing a Corbyn government anyway. I don't think that was an idle remark from Theresa May. I think that was the state saying we'll never allow socialism in this country. I think that certainly some of the tired arguments of cuts and all of this, if they manage to spin it, it's going to be in a very different way. But I think that argument's ridiculous. And I think the idea that we have to pay for another crisis, we paid for the banks and now we're being expected to pay. I think most people expect paying the fair share. But when you see things like, Richard Branson wanting money for his airline, I note that Virgin Australia has chose the same financial backers that Flybe. I think they're called Cirrus, but who backed Flybe and then left them to dry. I thought that was very interesting. But the notion that, the likes of Branson, your man who owns Weatherspoons and all of this, they've been completely exposed. Their image of, being friendly or, somehow supporting the working class. I think they've been exposed to what it is. It's a fraud.
What's interesting is that they talk about how everybody must survive ruthlessly in business and just it is survival of the fittest, and then they've got the full of pride, aren't they, about how well their businesses are doing, then they ask for a big public subsidy is what I wanted to say. So that's like against all the rules of business you can go for, isn't it? Well, but the airline's failing now. Can you prop this business up? But not. Some people might actually agree with such an idea to keep it going despite the ownership. But that's the irony there.
A failing corporation. It's funny how much they love socialism, isn't it?
Because it shows that really, to get services going, we still need public cooperation sometimes. In certain times, it turns on its head. Even the Conservative government realised they needed to get the railways to continue to run. Even before the pandemic, they'd renationalise one of the railways. At least as far as I'm aware, they had anyway, just because it was failing. And was it the East Coast Main Line that they took the franchise off? Mm-hmm. And to keep that going, they took the private franchise off and renationalised it.
Yeah, well, this is it. I think in that situation, it's a case of the government likes to privatise profit and nationalise debt because they know that the banks of the Bank of the UK isn't RBS; it's the people by way of their taxes. And so far, they know that the Bank of the UK presently won't charge any interest or anything like that, but instead offers free loans. So it's a good deal if you can get it.
So really, you make a lot of money when things are doing well, and then when they're not, you simply turn to yes, simple as that. Well, it's a long time till the election, so if we're talking about changes, things could change again rapidly. They could, for example, start cutting things again, such as benefits or before 2024. So that's so the way that the electorate perceive the handling of the pandemic. I mean, if things have calmed down by 2022, maybe that's also a reason why it won't factor as much in the election. Do you think?
I, personally, like I say, I think this particular virus is here to stay. I haven't seen a thing that suggests otherwise. So I think that this is going to plague the next election. Again, pardon the pun there. But I should imagine that it will be the 2024 election will be focusing on repaying debt and foreign policy. I think that this will have quite a large impact still. I suppose from trade union perspective, political perspective, or anyone just with some decency, now's the time to inoculate. It's the time to explain to people what's actually going on. What's going on is we have become one giant laboratory for an untested theory, a eugenics theory of this so-called herd immunity. We're being experimented on, and we should not accept, nor should we countenance the idea that we should pay for another crisis. We wouldn't, if just it's staggering amounts. I mean, when you consider the amount of cuts compared to the levels of tax evasion, well in their trillions in 10 years, and avoidance between 2010 and 2020, and you wonder how many people who, I don't see death statistics is those in the media do, which is just a number. I see it as someone's grandma, someone's brother, someone's best friend. Every death is unnecessary. And this just continues a legacy for me of the Tory cuts to disability entitlement, 130, 40, probably more, thousand committed suicide because it was that or starve. This is a continued legacy that at a time where a virus was sweeping through the world, we have Boris Johnson, who wants to shut down Parliament early so he can avoid scrutiny, go and hide in his fridge. We still aren't at 100,000 tests per individual per day. We have care workers going in without PPE. We have workers being told to go back to unsafe conditions. And frankly, we're already the laughing stock of the world, but where we're hell-bent on ideology, not to help our fellow man, but instead to try and isolate ourselves permanently. So, no, isolation in houses will continue. Isolation from the rest of the world is about to begin in January.
But it won't go on forever. I mean, that's just something that people themselves surely won't end up sticking to it. So you've got countries like Sweden, for example, who don't have such a policy. They actually seem to be practicing herd immunity.
And have you seen their stats of late?
I suppose you could tell us if it's gone much higher or something like that, which would mean that they're definitely practicing herd immunity.
Sweden is going to. I can see. Yes, things are not going very well in Sweden. This idea of herd immunity seems to have been completely and utterly disproven. The rates are increasing. The care homes, it's now. I think actually, if I'm right by this, but as of today, Sweden has the highest coronavirus death rate per capita. I think it's 6.08 deaths per million inhabitants. That's higher than the UK, US, or Italy.
What would be a roughly equivalent figure for the UK then, do you think, to compare that against?
Yeah, okay. So for the UK, 5.57. Belgium 4.28 and the US 4.11.
It doesn't seem as dramatically different in the UK where there is lockdown, so it doesn't necessarily completely quell the idea. But
no, but we're decreasing as Sweden's increasing because Sweden hasn't done anything. They've said, wander around. Herd immunity's guided them, and they're a country in which their death toll. Daily death toll and infection rates massively increasing.
And then social distancing is something that they presumably will be doing anyway. And in the United States, it seems to vary by state, doesn't it? Such as some places are in lockdown, some are not as such. And California is one of the only ones that has a form of house arrest, I think, one of them. And then you have some of the right wing, actually, some Trump supporters have anti-lockdown protests. And in this country, what's interesting is there's been figures like Piers Corbyn, who is Jeremy Corbyn's brother. He was at an anti-lockdown protest in Hyde Park, which is last weekend, according to the time we're recording this. Obviously, this is based on conspiracy theories. We won't necessarily go into all of that. But it shows also that there is some form of resistance as well to people having to live this sort of life. So what do you think? So what do you think of those protests that have happened in the United States and the couple that have happened in the UK?
I think it's laughable. I mean, just a general point to people who are protesting, for wanting their freedom back and all of that. Yeah, the notion of wanting freedom and to individually do what you choose, liberty in this way, of course I agree with it. But I always think it's funny how the people who are wanting to reopen everything never first want to reopen the libraries, do they? When you see someone who's carrying a big gun in the hand, demanding freedom, and it's a conspiracy, and it's a Democrat, or it's these people. Yeah, these people aren't often the ones to want to reopen libraries so they can go and read something.
Yes, those big placard signs saying, "I want my reading back. My library books are overdue," on placard signs. That'd be quite an amusing sight, wouldn't it?
You tend not to find that, do you? It's funny. The US response has been a joke. I mean, the president has clearly got mental issues, as I think the Democratic contender does as well. But there's the US response, and some of the, I'll quote an American friend who lives in California, some of the more sensible states, yes, they're continuing with lockdown and looking at evidence-based approaches, whereas I don't know, I had to chuckle. This is probably one of the worst things that I'm going to admit to, but I did laugh on two stories. I mean, well, three actually, if I can just share. One from Europe, which was the mass meeting a few weeks ago at Lord's, where the healing pools had to be closed because of the risk of virus, which I just thought that was hilarious.
It's very Simpsons, isn't it? It was very, very.
I thought in the US, where you had the mass meeting at one of these congregational churches, that in effect most of them had caught the virus, and then it was the guy who was saying it's, other than Trump, who was saying it's all a conspiracy, and all of this, has ended up posting a rather teary, disturbing video, having caught it from a hospital. Sorry, he'd caught it, but he was recording the video from a hospital, explaining how it wasn't. And I just think that if your intention is clear, that you've got an alternative, then you should protest. Absolutely. I tend to go on at least one protest a year. Just tends to be. But I've never been on a protest where there hasn't been an alternative proposal. These people I've got no alternative proposal. They just want to reopen.
I suppose social distancing would, although it's often about denying that there is a virus at all, or that it's something else. So that's what's an interesting perspective, whatever you think of that, because that really feeds into the conspiracy there. But also, you could just be protesting against lockdown itself to say that social distancing is enough, because of the mental effects of lockdown and such like, because that there could be another way of doing it than that. So that's. I mean, also there's whatever big changes happen, there's always going to be alternative things. So what's interesting here is that the biggest poster person of conspiracy theories, ever since the Wogan interview of 1991, where he talked about being the son of God, has had his YouTube channel completely removed and Facebook group. What do you think of actual censorship of information at a time like this, such as David Icke having his YouTube channel removed and also Facebook? So do you think there should be the freedom of ideas, or do you actually believe that censorship, you actually believe that censorship should be there for the good of people who might get misinformation about what this thing is?
I think if you're instructing someone to do something that's dangerous, so drink bleach,
Donald Trump said that, didn't he? He said he was talking, or did he talk about, well, why couldn't we get disinfectant inside the body? It works so well outside.
Or sunlight, for that matter. What an odd character he is. Then, if it's all right for him to say that and that's broadcast, my own view is in fact, as much as David Icke expresses pretty obviously anti-Semitic information. Some of his political commentary is interesting, but by and large, again, a very unusual character. I don't believe that. I mean, he said other things that if you were going to censor him, that would have been the time to do it. But with this, it might surprise some people listening, actually, which is I don't see that he has said or done anything that maybe it's caused some damage in terms of 5G masts, but I don't believe in censorship of. My own view is you should have freedom of expression, freedom of speech, unless you want to take other people's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, in which I don't believe you should have that luxury or that right. Is my own view.
So you can just say.
I agree with you on that, Jay. I think you're allowed to express your own feelings whenever necessary, as long as it's, like you said before, it's not going to hurt somebody or cause somebody to become ill or injured. Yeah, as I say, it happens all the time. You've got Trump there, and even some of there's a lot of others with wicked views, but it's publicised all the time. So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, so that people can make up their own minds as well about what to do with the information. But I suppose it seems like so treating people at a very low level to say that you must only get certain information. You should and you can't make up your own minds as to the validity of it. So I mean, David likes. But so I'll be interested to do some conspiracy interviews, and it will be interesting because it's always interesting going into the mind of things. And of course, and I'll even say it on this, we don't know for sure what the real truth ever is because we're all in small situations that we don't. So that always makes it interesting to listen to alternative views. But he simply says in his case, or has done, that there is no COVID-19 for the various reasons that he says that. So
I think as we come to a close and what have you, it's the just took me two thoughts are. Yeah, there are staggering levels of misinformation out there. Kids are taught that Columbus was the first to reach the Americas. He wasn't, at all. That was, Leif Erikson could be some Irish even earlier than that. That was once laughed at, but the staggering levels of evidence is there.
1492, yes. So go on.
History is littered with utter nonsense. The headlines today, you never see in the Daily Mail, do you, front page, trade union wins great pay for workers. But instead it's greedy this, greedy that, and all of that. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but I think just closing my thoughts on David Icke, I have to come back to that film, Carry On, Doctor, with Matron and all of that. And it opens up with a David Icke style character who says, he believes in alternative thinking and he'll never end up in hospital until he ends up breaking his leg. And then he's sort of humiliatingly forced to, sort of go through surgery and all of the rest of it. I think that's it with David Icke. He just shouldn't. There've been so many other things he's said that could have prompted a reaction, but for this, it creates you suppress people and it creates martyrs, and that's one thing from history that and present day that we know. And so for a lot of people, they are now thinking, well, actually, what he's said, it must have hit a nerve. Yes. So actually the chances are there's more people now who think he's right because of censorship than
that he could be obviously, and that's just so really a better strategy would be from their point of view would have been just to say that's just David Icke saying that sort of thing, but when you actually go to the trouble of deleting his content, that will make a lot of people think, oh, well, actually, there might be something in that. So, you were going to compare 1665, weren't you? Which is the the Great Fire of London happened in '66. I've got an interview about the response that the village of Eyam, quite famously in history, had, which is that they did their own lockdown in Derbyshire to try and stop the spread of the plague going further than the village. So, what were your thoughts on how today's events compare to what was going on in this country in 1665?
Well, it was just really some thoughts. I mean, the countries that tend to it started off by looking at the countries that seem to be doing better with this. Not that it's competition or anything, but seem to be doing better with this virus in terms of controlling it. Tend to be the newer countries. So you look at New Zealand, South Korea, Germany. Versus the countries that are struggling with this, which is England, Spain, Italy, France, and all of that. And it occurred to me, having looked at the response from the Great Plague of London in 1665, that a lot of the advice that we've seen in the past few months is replicated from there. So, for example, social distancing, 2 meters comes from this period. You've got other notions such as people being locked down. We know of the famous crosses and whatever else. The other ideas as well, in terms of isolate for 7 days. That the holy number basically of 7 days.
So you're saying it's not really based on the science so much as just what we used to do in the plague, when we had so much less knowledge of how it worked and how it was spread. And they didn't have the metric system then, did they? So it must have been a slightly different length to keep away from.
It most certainly was a different length. Yes, I think actually the length they were using was something like 1.5 meters in today's money, but I think it's a very good, away from London. I think the village of Eyam really does also fit in quite nicely to this idea that we're not really that further advanced in terms of what's what. I mean, whilst Trump today suggests drinking Dettol or Domestos, just as in Eyam where they were advised to drink, I think it was bacon fat or something like that, to try and initiate vomiting to restore the so-called 4 humours and all of that. So I think the problem with drinking so much bacon fat is they needed some bread with it. For a bit of bread and dripping, and obviously that answer was for people who had money, because meat and what have you is very expensive. But yeah, I think there's a lot of comparisons with what was going on back in 1665 and the advice that's being given today. Isolation, when you can go out. Yes, there's absolutely loads. So what would invite, I appreciate time's short, but what I would invite people to do is you can have a look on YouTube at the Great Plague of London by just typing in Great Plague of London documentary, and it will goes into what was going on.
Now, apart from the fact that the place went on fire and it pretty much destroyed London as it was and they had to rebuild, they didn't go back to a new normal after the Great Plague, did they? Things did go back to normal. It did go away. So why can't we have the same now, that this is just going to go away as well, which presumably is going to?
Well, I mean, what is a good point. What happened afterwards is the year later you had the Great Fire of London. The two aren't related. You had the government and locals blaming firstly the Jews, and then it was the Dutch and the Huguenots. So there was a lot of, the baker, the baker's shop, controlled by immigrants, and there was a lot of that. But the extent of damage there meant that no, the capital didn't return back to normal. Instead of the close, cramped nature of medieval housing seen not so much today anymore, but you can get a flavour of it on the old Butcher's Street in York, known as the Shambles, to see how very close-knit everything was if you lived in a city. Instead, you had vast boulevards springing up. Some of the landscapers designing cities to have parks, that there's distancing. And ultimately, if it wasn't for the plague and fire, we wouldn't really have had, at the time, the idea of a metropolitan fire brigade. So things didn't quite return back to normal. People were taxed. In fact, the top of my head, I believe they even debated returning Henry VIII's beard tax, so tax on facial hair.
Wow. Well, I'd be caught out by that, wouldn't I? Suspect a lot of us would be. So there was a new normal in that old new normal. There was an old new normal, and it was some of it was positive and negative, but it was kind of revolutionary on society. But obviously not just simply keeping lockdown. And the X's were painted on the doors. We don't seem to. The equivalent that you can compare that to today is this contact app that they're coming out with, maybe, where you will self-report if you download it and paint your own X on your own door. I assume, in a technological sense.
If we look at it in a different way, more abstractly, what happened was, 50 years before the Great Plague of London, there was still other, bubonic plague was still common everywhere else too, pneumonic, etc. And the difference is that they had for the first time the ability to look through a microscope and see this other world, really, this alien world. And that began to change the way that people think. I mean, the idea of change is constant. We try and resist and go back to what we know, point A. We never really want to go to point B. So there's a lot of resistance, acceptance, and that huge curve there. But actually, point B becomes point A again. And it's the way that things happen. But in an abstract way, if it wasn't for the plagues during the Enlightenment period, we wouldn't have ended up with the growth of science. We'd have still been stuck, chemistry. The alchemists who were trying to make gold out of God knows what, gave birth to chemistry, which gave birth to the idea that you could inject chemicals into you as a cure, or use chemicals on surfaces. I was just taking the Michael out of Trump then. But this idea that, you can begin looking at the way bacteria operate, it actually meant that this new normal would have been quite frightening for people, because, you're going from a hyper-religious, everything is due to God, you've just had a civil war, and then we've got science and reason, and there's 6 planets, 7 now, 8, you've got looking at the heavens, you've got this great explosion in science and scientific societies, the explosion of literature, you've got the hence the Enlightenment. You then move on to the Industrial Revolution, really hand in hand with that. And so the new normal, we were never destined, really. I know this plague occurred in London, but the impact was still felt broadly. You've got this idea, really, with it's only 60 years later, you've got changes in agriculture, Turnip Townsend, you've got then industrialization beginning, steam being used, that we never returned back to the farms, the agrarian society that we was.
Yeah, this will be the same now, that things will change, some of it good as well, because of it. So what do you think Do you think lockdown was enforced in roughly the similar way back then? I know, obviously, the main problem then would have been entertainment at home, obviously, because you didn't have all these things to distract you. But was it? Well, are there parallels in how they enforced lockdown during the Great Plague of London compared to what happened here around the world?
Absolutely. You didn't have necessarily a police force. Bow Street runners don't come for, I think, 1720s is their date, but you do have a lot of enforcing going on. So commissioners in the poor law unions, as they were called, the church authorities, would be responsible for enforcing lockdown. I mean, pretty horrendous, really, when you think of it. You had this sort of commissioner who was responsible to see whether or not people inside a house were still alive. And I recall one story of someone, a family of five, three of them had died, leaving the mother and the youngest son. And the mother displayed symptoms, and of course the cross goes on the door, and it was the responsibility for a commissioner to go and see who was alive, but they didn't do that directly. They often had sort of very young apprentice to go in, and of course what had happened there is both had died.
Yes, You've then got they didn't have any social distancing or the procedures themselves to.
Yes, they did.
They must have had something.
You would go into lockdown on as soon as there was any. If you came into contact with anyone who had any symptom, you went into lockdown.
Yes.
There are some examples of different colour crosses being used, so not just the black and red denoting a plague house and whether people were in it, but there are some other symbols that were used to denote whether someone had contacted. I mean, there's two things. In a different way, people were still left baskets of food. This was seen as quite a pious thing to do. So they were given foodstuffs and, medication that did more worse than harm quite often, left at the door. But it was rigidly policed that you did not leave. If you imagine how unsanitary that is, where do you go to the toilet? Where do you get your fuel from? It's going to be cold, damp, horrible, dark conditions. But another thing to note is what was happening after. So a house was emptied. Then, if there was a will in place, which most people didn't have, then they would the contents of the house would be given to surviving family. But if there wasn't, then you had this sort of free for all, this auction really of items, as well as some items being kept as a fee for the Poor Law Commission, who basically raided your house once you died.
Oh yes. Because these days it would have been better with PS4s and all sorts of other spoils that you could get, but it's not quite dealt with in the same way. But when the officials going in to see who was there and what protection would they have used? Because obviously social distancing is difficult when you're going around to check the houses of the dead and dying.
Well, from their perspective, you wouldn't be seen, and again, pardon the pun here, you wouldn't be seen dead without wearing one of the plague masks. One of the long-nose masks. The idea was that all disease spread through the air in what was called miasma, and they believed that if you, at the end of that very long nose, if your listeners can picture a sort of very big nose, you might see them in Venice today, but the old plague mask, and if you're not sure what I'm referring to, just have a look on Google, just type in plague mask, and at the end of the nose was perfumes, roses, anything that was sweet smelling. It's actually probable that the origin of the couture and perfume houses of Paris and Milan and other such places actually originated in generating sweet smells, because the notion was if something smelt nice and didn't smell rotten or anything like that, then that would give you immunity. Not wearing a mask would be seen as absolutely crazy. So for very, very different ways if we were somehow to bring a commissioner from either 1348, the Black Death, or 1665, or any of the subsequent outbreaks, even cholera to today, they'd think it really unusual that we're sending people into work without masks.
Well, yes. I mean, it's the most basic protection. How long do you think? I mean, I'm not sure if you'll know this. How long did they think, if they were able to manage to survive the plague? How long did they want the people who had got the plague to stay inside the house for?
Oh, I answered that before. 7 days.
Just 7 days, and not 14. So I wonder if it could have still spread after 7 days.
If you had it, you'd be dead within, in some instances, within the day. But within 3 days.
Whereas this one's annoying because it takes a while for symptoms to show, and then we don't quite know how long afterwards it's lingering about for. So that's what's interesting about how they work as well. The viruses grapple onto the cell and have to get keys, almost encryption keys, to get in, don't they? So it's they have to take time to work on the invasion before you get to see the symptoms and the result of its invasion. This can be between sort of 5 and 7 days, but it could be longer than that. I'm not sure they even know, but it takes a while for it to mount all that inside the body. So that's the problem. I wonder if the plague was similar to that, and therefore it's getting passed unknown as well.
Well, yeah, I think rats have had a bit of a bad rap. Current thoughts are it was actually man's best friend that was responsible for passing the infection to us. So, yes, next time you look at your dog, maybe just think twice.
I stroked the dog yesterday. So hopefully dogs and cats, well, they have said that they could be able to get it, possibly. So that's an unfortunate thing, if they can. Well, we're just drawing towards the 2 hours now, which is about what this is going to be. So I'd like to thank you for turning up this afternoon to talk about it. Still in English lockdown, and you, Colin, as well, although you can go out for a drive at least, but can't do much of most things in society at the moment. So we can do that, or you can go for a long walk or cycle ride and avoid people with social distancing all throughout. Yeah. So
I look forward to going to walk my dog.
Yes, that's right. One of the great freedoms we now have, as well as that. Yeah. So that's.
Well, thank you again for having me on, and everyone listening, keep safe.
Yes, stay safe, stay alert. Most importantly, if you're an ordinary person, control the virus, because you can do that because you're just ordinary, even though you can't see it. That's what they want you to do. Stay safe, stay alert, and control that virus. So there you go. That was the insights of Jay Martin on our world. Society and politics. The Jay Martin interview. It was a Channel 107 production.